Let's get these benchmarks underway. Up first, we have multi-threaded rendering. Turning this on allows VALORANT to use all cores of your CPU. If set to off, it will only use the first core. When we benchmark the options, we notice a significant drop in FPS as expected. The drop ranges from about 18 to 22% and will certainly be much higher on older CPUs. VALORANT should really just remove the ability to turn this setting off, since there is no use for it whatsoever. Moving on to material quality. Taking a look at the actual difference in render quality, we can notice a very little difference at all between high and medium setting. We also notice a clear downgrade for the low setting. This certainly doesn't justify using the high setting over medium when we can boost 4% FPS using the medium setting. Using the low setting provides another 4% FPS boost while also removing some of the shadows in darker corners, which is a good thing. As a result, low is going to be the recommended setting here for better vision in dark corners and a significant FPS boost. Moving on to texture quality. We see no visual differences between the settings. We see no difference in FPS. I've also cross-checked with forcing the setting via NVIDIA and the results are still the same. This setting changes nothing, so we shall set it to medium for no reason at all. Moving on, we have detail quality. We start to notice some bigger differences here. High setting has additional cosmetics like this foliage here and extra texture detail below the window over here. These extra details come at the cost of 7% to our FPS performance. Comparing medium and low settings, we see no visual difference, and as expected, there is no significant difference in FPS between the two either. Here, we once again notice the texture differences on the far wall. We will go over recommended setting of medium here, as the 7% FPS increase is too big to pass up for just some scattered wall texture upgrades. If you're well above your monitor's refresh rate and you have the FPS to spare, this will be one of the settings you might want to bump up to high. Next up, we have UI quality. There is nothing to compare here. This setting has no effect on in-game visuals or FPS at all. So let's take a look at what exactly does the setting do. If we bring up our menu and change the UI quality setting, we notice the low setting gives the menu an opaque background with almost zero transparency. Moving to medium quality, we gain some background transparency and the ability to still see some of our game while in the menus. Going higher to the high setting adds some blur effect visuals to the background. It is worth noting that holding tab to look at the scoreboard during gameplay is not affected by this setting at all. Given that there is no performance hit here at all during gameplay, we will set this to medium, as that offers us the best visuals for competitive play, in the off chance that you are changing settings mid-round. Up next, we have Vignette. Vignette has no real effect on FPS performance at all. The visual effect added to the game by turning this feature on is a very minor shade at the top and bottom of the screen. Given there is no real benefit to this option other than making us feel slightly more sleepy, we're gonna recommend setting this to off. Next up, we have VSync. Normally, we'd recommend setting this to off, but we won't just skip benchmarking this setting as there is some things we can measure here. Taking a look at the first two tests, we have a comparison between a 240 FPS limit set via NVIDIA control panel versus the same limit set via VALORANT's menu. As is often the case in most games, we notice a much cleaner performance with less noise if we use NVIDIA control panel instead of the game in order to limit FPS. If we compare the VSync option the same way, we see no real difference between using it via NVIDIA control panel or using the VALORANT in-game menu. In summary, if you're experiencing tearing, then it's worth giving VSync a try as it will eliminate tearing, but if you don't need VSync, I strongly recommend setting this to off and taking full advantage of higher frame rates. Up next is a very interesting one, AntiAliasing. Let's start with the performance differences. MSAA 2x gives a 7 to 8% FPS drop, and MSAA 4x adds an additional 5% FPS drop. FXAA provides a relatively low performance hit of only 3 to 4% in FPS. To figure out the best settings, we need to compare the visual differences here. This first still image here shows how the FXAA settings shines by providing the crispest image of the knife edge. The image improvement provided by MSAA 2 and 4X seem rather minuscule. In this next test, we will take a look at the performance of these settings during movement. Here, we notice FXAA provide worse flickering of texture edges and the worst clarity when reading text. Coincidentally, this is also where MSAA 2 and 4X really shine. MSAA 2X reduces some of this flickering, but 4X almost completely eliminates it. Given that Valorant is a third-person shooter, we can safely exclude FXAA as a choice, since it will degrade visuals and performance unless you're standing still camping a spot. MSAA 2 and 4X provide substantial visual improvements that will help us see more clearly, especially when trying to accurately aim at long distances. But this improvement comes at a reasonable FPS cost. If your FPS is high enough that you can run MSAA 4X and take the 12 to 13% FPS hit, then it is highly recommended as it provides a necessary improvement for aiming clarity, especially at long ranges. However, if your FPS is cause for concern or you're not reaching your monitor's refresh rate, then you might want to consider MSAA 2X at the cost of only 7 to 8% FPS drop. Up next, we shall take a closer look at anisotropic filtering. Visually, we see a difference of absolutely nothing. Excluding the fact that 2x seems to always be a couple of frames lower than expected even after repeat tests, the trend seems to be a slow linear FPS drop totaling 1% FPS from 1x to 16x. But the real question here is, what does anisotropic filtering actually do for us? I'm glad you asked, because it's a subtle one. Taking a look at this still image reveals an improvement in crispness of the neon lights on this Vandal from 1x to 4x. Unfortunately, there is no visual improvement between 8x and 16x, making 4x the clear and uncontested winner here. Next up, we have improved clarity. This is the most interesting and controversial setting. Taking a look at the FPS performance, we see a substantial drop in FPS, ranging from 4 to 11% depending on what is being rendered. So what do we get in return for this performance drop? One would expect an improved visual clarity, as the name implies. Unfortunately, if we take a still image and zoom in to see this controversial clarity, we end up seeing no difference. To further verify this result, we set up a camera on a tripod and took still images to compare. Zooming in on these images again shows no visual improvement, finally busting the myth that improving clarity actually improves clarity. Now we can confidently set this one to off, knowing we are gaining a lot of FPS and losing nothing in return. Moving on to bloom. We see there is definitely a noticeable FPS drop. It seems to range from 1 to 2% FPS. So how does bloom actually affect us? Taking a look at this still, here we see the bloom effect creating a brightness effect on the Vandal's neon trim. Even though bloom on might make the game look slightly more realistic, the truth is it only gets in the way of clearer vision. We can confidently set this one to off and save that extra 1 to 2%. Next up is distortion. The pattern is a very slight FPS drop when turned on, which is usually below 1% difference. So what does distortion actually do? Likely distort some visual elements of the game, but whatever they are, we struggle to find them. We can confidently set this on to off for the extra couple of frames and possibly get rid of some subtle distorting. Up next we have first-person shadows. Lowering our FPS between 2 to 3.5% for this one, we can only hope for something in return. Unfortunately, this setting has no effect on the game world, and even more unfortunately, the character models in this game have no ground shadows. So what does first-person shadows actually do? It adds shadows and lighting effects to our hands and firearm, which you'd need to pay special attention to in order to even notice. We're going to recommend off for this setting as it is not needed and the 3.5% FPS is a more welcome boost to our game. Before we wrap this one up, there's one more benchmark I'd like to do, since I know lots of us prefer to game in windowed borderless mode so we can watch YouTube or Twitch during those lengthy warm-up periods. Without doubt, as expected, we see a drop in performance in the range of 3 to 4% FPS. If you'd like to further increase your Valorant performance, I have another video on improving performance through Windows settings. If this video helped you at all, a sub would be amazing. Thank you, and I wish you all many happy frags.